Have you ever noticed how some people don't seem to do much, yet everything around them shifts? They don't argue, they don't explain, they don't rush to respond. At a certain point, they simply step back. And strangely, that's when people begin to pay attention. The energy changes. Conversations start circling back to them, not loudly, but clearly enough that you can feel it. And it leads to a quiet question. What would happen if you did the same? Not disappearing out of frustration, not withdrawing to prove a point, but simply choosing not to be constantly available, emotionally, mentally, even physically. Just for a moment, stepping out of the pattern of always being there. Because if you look closely, most interactions are built on something very subtle, predictability. People don't just respond to what you say, they respond to how consistent you are, how quickly you reply, how reliably you show up. And over time, without anyone saying it out loud, a pattern forms. They expect you to be there. They rely on it. And you begin to live inside that expectation. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves. But there's another layer beneath that. When you are no longer as available, when your responses are no longer automatic, something begins to shift. Some people become curious, some start reaching out more, and some feel uncomfortable in ways they can't explain. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because something they were used to is no longer there. And this is where it becomes interesting. Because it doesn't just reveal them, it reveals you. It shows how much of your energy has been given away in small, almost invisible ways. The quick reply you didn't think about, the yes you gave just to keep things smooth, the moments you set yourself aside without even noticing. They don't feel like much at the time, but over days, over weeks, they accumulate. And then one day you feel it, not as something dramatic, but as a quiet exhaustion. A kind of frustration that doesn't fully make sense, an emptiness, even when everything seems fine on the surface. That's not random. That's the cost of being too available for too long. But this isn't about becoming distant. It's not about turning your back on people. It's something more subtle than that. It's about beginning to notice where your energy goes and choosing more carefully when to give it. Because sometimes silence isn't absence, it's control. And stepping back isn't rejection, it's clarity. They may not understand it at first, some might question it, some might even test it, but over time, something changes. Not because you forced anything, but because you are no longer moving the same way. So the question stays with you. If you were no longer always there, always responding, always available, what would really change? Part 1, the trap of always being available. Have you ever felt tired, even when nothing serious really happened? Have you ever noticed a kind of quiet frustration or an emptiness that's hard to explain? It doesn't come from one big moment. It builds slowly, from small, repeated patterns. Being there, responding, adjusting, keeping things smooth. None of it looks like a problem. In fact, it often looks like care. But over time, something begins to drain. Not loudly, not in a way that demands attention, just a slow leak of energy that eventually turns into exhaustion. And the reason is simpler than it seems. Too much availability, given in the wrong places. This isn't about turning away from the world. It's not about becoming distant or cold. It's something much quieter than that. A shift inward, a return to center. What Carl Jung described as individuation, the process of becoming whole, authentic, complete. And strangely, that process doesn't begin with doing more. It begins with stepping back. Because silence, when it is chosen, carries more weight than 1,000 explanations. And withdrawal, when it comes from awareness, is not escape. It is control. So there's a question that lingers. How long does a person keep reacting before realizing they are no longer choosing? How many times does a response happen automatically before it becomes a pattern that others rely on? Because this is where things become clear. From a very early point, most people are conditioned to be available, to respond quickly, to please, to say yes, even when something inside resists. And over time, this becomes identity. Worth becomes tied to presence, to usefulness, to how easily access is given. But here's a truth that rarely gets said directly. Excessive availability is not a virtue. It is a trap. Because the more accessible someone becomes, the more predictable they appear. And everything predictable eventually becomes a tool. They begin to use that pattern. Not always consciously, not always intentionally, But it happens. They reach out when they need attention, when they want comfort, when they need distraction. And once that need is satisfied, they step away until the next time. Like pressing a button that is always there is, it doesn't feel like being used, it feels like being needed, which is why the pattern continues. Carl Jung spoke about the persona, the mask shaped to be accepted, loved, recognized. And for many, that mask becomes the one who is always available, always understanding, always responsive. But the more that role is maintained, the more something essential begins to fade, because being constantly present in the lives of others often means slowly disappearing from one's own. This is the quiet form of self-abandonment. Not dramatic, not visible, but deeply consistent. It shows up in the instant replies when energy is low, in the explanations that were never necessary, in the effort to maintain an image instead of honoring a feeling. And all of it comes at a cost. Peace begins to thin out. Energy becomes scattered. Attention is given away as if it were unlimited. But it isn't. And those who expect constant availability are rarely attached to the person. They are attached to what is provided. Validation, presence, emotional support. And the moment that pattern shifts, the reaction appears. Confusion, irritation, sometimes even accusation. Not because anything wrong was done, but because something familiar stopped working. Because the role changed. And here's the most uncomfortable truth of all. The more available someone becomes, the less they are valued, because what is always there is rarely respected. No one protects what they never fear losing. No one values what requires no effort to reach. So maybe the question is not about them. Maybe it's this. At what point did availability become automatic? At what point did silence feel wrong? At what point did giving more seem like the only way to keep something? Because before anything changes on the outside, that pattern has to be seen clearly on the inside. And once it is seen, even slightly, something begins to shift. Part 2, the mechanism of lowering your position. Have you ever noticed how things don't break all at once, but slowly lose their balance? No clear moment, no obvious reason, just a feeling that something is no longer the same. Imagine this. You begin to lean toward them, just a little more, not in an obvious way, not in a way anyone could point out. You just respond a bit faster. You try to keep the conversation going a little longer. You put in a little more effort to make sure nothing fades away. At first, it feels completely normal. It looks like care. It feels like you're building connection. But right there, the imbalance begins. Because in every interaction, there is always something unspoken, yet deeply felt. An invisible scale, constantly adjusting, constantly measuring, who is investing more, who is waiting more, who is needing more. And the moment you lean to one side, that scale begins to tilt. Not loudly, not suddenly, but enough to shift the entire dynamic. Think about this. When one person keeps moving forward, the other doesn't move closer, they move back. Not because they want to leave, not because they are trying to create distance, but because the distance is no longer necessary, because you already closed it. And when distance disappears, tension disappears. When tension disappears, value disappears with it. This is where most people get it wrong. They think giving more creates connection. They believe effort will be matched. They assume constant presence makes them more important. But human psychology doesn't work that way. It doesn't respond to effort. It responds to perception. And perception is always shaped by balance. You keep showing up, you keep responding, you keep adjusting yourself to keep everything stable. Not once, but repeatedly. And each time it happens, a signal is sent. Not through words, but through behavior. That access to you is easy, that your presence is guaranteed, that no effort is required, you will always be there. And once that becomes the unspoken rule, everything begins to change. They invest less, they wait less, they no longer feel the need to move toward you, not because they didn't value you at the beginning, but because the structure of the interaction made this outcome inevitable. Because anything that is always available stops creating desire. It becomes background, something that is always there but no longer noticed. And that's when something starts to feel off. Not immediately, but gradually. They initiate less, they try less, they show up less, and from the outside it looks like they changed. But in reality, the change started long before that. In the moments you gave more than necessary. In the times you chose to maintain the connection instead of maintaining yourself. When this isn't seen clearly, it's easy to believe the problem is them. But when you begin to see it, something else becomes clear. This is not about losing them. This is about losing position. And that doesn't happen when they walk away. It happens when you give too much, too easily, for too long. So the real question is no longer, why did they change? But at what moment did the balance begin to tilt without being noticed? When did giving stop being a choice and become a reflex? Because once that moment is seen clearly, everything becomes clear. And once it is clear, there is no going back to the same pattern again. Part 3, the leak of psychic energy. Have you ever noticed how some days leave you exhausted even when nothing important really happened? No major conflict, no heavy work, just conversations, messages, small reactions, one after another. And yet, by the end of the day, something feels off. A kind of fatigue that isn't physical. A restlessness that doesn't go away. A quiet sense that your energy has been pulled in too many directions. Now think about this. What if the problem is not what happened, but how often you reacted? Because every time you respond without awareness, something leaves you. Not dramatically, not in a way you can see, but consistently. Carl Jung didn't see the mind as something passive. He saw it as an energy system. Every thought, every emotion, every reaction consumes a part of that energy. And the real question is not how much you have, but where it is going. Think about how easily energy gets spent. A message that didn't need a reply, but gets one anyway. A comment that didn't matter, but stays in your head for hours. A moment of silence that feels uncomfortable, so it gets filled immediately. None of these seem important, but they accumulate. Because you keep reacting, you keep engaging, you keep giving attention, even when nothing valuable is being returned. And without realizing it, your inner system starts to weaken. Not because you are incapable, but because your energy is scattered. Jung once said, "What you resist persists." But there's another layer to that. What you constantly react to begins to control you, because reaction removes choice. It turns awareness into reflex. And the moment that happens, you are no longer directing your energy. You are being directed by everything around you. This is where exhaustion truly comes from. Not from doing too much, but from reacting too often to things that don't deserve your energy. And here is where it becomes dangerous. Because when energy is low, clarity fades. When clarity fades, boundaries disappear. And when boundaries disappear, everything starts to enter your space. They begin to sense it. Not consciously, but instinctively. They notice that you respond to everything, that you absorb every emotion, that you try to fix, explain, maintain, no matter what. And slowly they lean into that, not because they are bad, but because the opening is there. Because when someone doesn't guard their energy, the world will use it. And over time, this creates a deeper problem, not just exhaustion, but vulnerability. Because a person who is constantly drained becomes easier to influence, easier to provoke, easier to pull into dynamics that don't serve them. This is why some people always feel overwhelmed, not because life is harder for them, but because their energy is never protected. Now consider the opposite. A person who doesn't react immediately, who doesn't engage with everything, who can sit in silence without needing to respond. There is a different presence there, not louder, not more aggressive, but more stable, because their energy is contained. And when energy is contained, it builds. It becomes focus. It becomes clarity. It becomes a kind of quiet power that doesn't need to prove itself. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about a balanced psyche. Not someone who avoids the world, but someone who knows what deserves a response and what does not. Because real control is not about doing more. It's about choosing where energy goes. So maybe the real question is not, why am I so tired? But where is my energy going every single day? What am I reacting to that doesn't deserve my attention? Because once that becomes clear, everything begins to change. Not all at once, but slowly as the leaks are closed. And when energy stops leaking, something else begins to return. Presence, clarity, and a kind of control that was never really lost, just given away. Part 4. The moment you step back, the game reveals itself. Have you ever noticed how nothing really becomes clear until you stop reacting? Not when you explain more, not when you try harder, but in the exact moment you step back. Now think about this. For a long time, the pattern has been running quietly. You respond, you adjust, you keep things smooth, and because of that, everything appears stable. But what happens when that pattern is interrupted? Not dramatically, not with confrontation, just a pause, a delay in response, a moment of silence where there used to be immediacy, a decision not to engage right away. And suddenly, something begins to surface. They notice it, not always consciously, but they feel it. The shift, because what they were used to is no longer there. And this is where things start to reveal themselves. Some become curious, they reach out more, they wonder what changed. They begin to pay attention in a way they didn't before. Others react differently. They become impatient. They question you. They try to pull a reaction out of you just to restore what they were used to. And some become uncomfortable. Not because you did something wrong, but because something they relied on is no longer predictable. Think about that for a moment. Nothing new was added. Nothing was taken away except your automatic reaction. And yet, everything changed. Because the dynamic was never built on words. It was built on access, on how easily they could reach you, on how quickly they could get a response, on how predictable your presence was. And the moment that access becomes uncertain, the entire structure begins to shake. This is where the truth becomes visible, not through what they say, but through how they react. Who respects the space, who tries to invade it, who becomes more present, and who disappears. This is information. Raw. Unfiltered. More honest than anything that was shown before. Because when everything is easy, nothing needs to be revealed. But when something changes, real intentions surface. Carl Jung spoke about projection, the idea that people reveal themselves through what they react to. And this is exactly where that happens. When you stop reacting, they start reacting. And in that reaction, everything becomes clear. Who needed control? Who needed validation? Who was only present because you were always available? This is why stepping back feels so powerful. Not because it forces anyone to come closer, but because it removes the illusion. The illusion that everything was balanced. The illusion that effort was mutual. The illusion that the connection was as stable as it seemed. And once that illusion breaks, you can no longer see things the same way, because now it's visible. The imbalance, the dependency, the dynamic that was quietly shaping everything. So maybe the real power is not in doing more. Maybe it's in removing what was never meant to be there. The over-explaining, the over-responding, the constant availability. Because when those disappear, what remains is truth. And truth doesn't need to be chased. It reveals itself. So the question becomes simple. When you stop reacting, what begins to surface? Because whatever appears in that space is what was always there, waiting to be seen. Part 5, silence is not absence. It is control. Have you ever noticed how silence makes people uncomfortable? Not loud silence, not distance that is obvious, but the kind of silence that comes when a reaction was expected but never arrived. A message sent but no immediate reply. A moment that usually gets filled, left untouched. A space where something used to happen now remains still. And suddenly the energy shifts. Because silence does something that words never can. It creates space. Now think about this. For a long time, the pattern has been built on response, on immediacy, on the constant flow of interaction. Every message answered, every tension addressed, every gap filled. That rhythm becomes familiar, expected, almost automatic. But the moment that rhythm is broken, silence enters. And silence changes everything. Not because it pushes people away, but because it forces them to face the space, a space where there is no control, no certainty, no immediate feedback. And in that space, the mind begins to work. They start to think, to question, to replay, not because you did something, but because you didn't. This is the power most people overlook. They believe control comes from saying more, explaining more, clarifying more. But real control often comes from removing all of that, because when you explain, you reduce tension. When you react, you resolve uncertainty. And when there is no tension, no uncertainty, there is nothing left to feel. But silence does the opposite. It holds tension. It preserves uncertainty. It creates weight. And weight creates presence. This is why some people don't need to say much, yet everything they do feels significant. Because their words are not constant. Their reactions are not predictable. Their presence is not always available. And because of that, it is felt more deeply. Think about how often energy is lost through unnecessary words. Explaining something that didn't need explanation, defending something that didn't need defense, responding to something that didn't deserve attention. Each time, Something is given away, not visibly, but internally. And over time, it adds up until silence begins to feel uncomfortable, until not responding feels like losing control. But in reality, that's where control begins, because silence is not about avoidance. It's not about disconnecting. It's about choosing. Choosing what deserves attention and what does not. Choosing when to speak and when to remain still. Choosing not to fill every space just because it exists. And when that choice becomes clear, something shifts internally. There is less urgency, less pressure to respond, less need to maintain every interaction, and externally, something shifts as well. They begin to feel it. The difference, not always consciously, but unmistakably. Because when someone is no longer reacting automatically, they become harder to read, harder to predict, and anything that cannot be easily predicted gains weight, gains presence, gains a kind of quiet authority that doesn't need to be announced. This is why silence can feel so powerful, not because it forces attention, but because it creates it. So maybe the question is not, why does silence feel uncomfortable? Maybe it's this. What has been lost in the need to always respond? What has been given away in the habit of always explaining? Because once that becomes clear, silence no longer feels empty. It feels intentional. And in that intention, there is control. Conclusion. Have you ever realized that nothing really changes until you stop doing what has always felt normal? Not when you try harder, not when you give more, but in the quiet moment, you begin to pull your energy back. Because when everything is seen clearly, the pattern becomes undeniable. It was never about them changing. It was never about not being enough. It was about how much was given without being questioned. Too much presence, too much response, too much availability in places that never required that level of access. And over time, that created the very thing most people try to avoid, being taken for granted, not because people are cruel, but because human nature does not protect what is always available. And once you see that, something shifts internally. Not dramatically, not in a way that needs to be announced, just a quiet awareness, a recognition that not everything deserves a response, that not every silence needs to be filled, that not every connection is meant to be maintained. And from that awareness, a different way of moving begins to form. Slower, more deliberate, less reactive, because now it is no longer about holding everything together. It's about holding your center. This is where the real change begins. Not in what you say, not in what you do, but in what you no longer feel the need to give away, the constant explanations, the immediate replies. The automatic reactions, they begin to fall away, and in their place, something else appears, space. And within that space, something stronger starts to take shape. Clarity, presence, a kind of quiet control that doesn't depend on anyone else. They will notice it. Some will come closer. Some will pull away. Some will try to test it just to see if the old version is still there. But this time, the pattern is different because the response is no longer automatic. The energy is no longer scattered. And the position is no longer being lowered without awareness. So the question is no longer, how do you make them stay? It becomes something else entirely. What actually deserves your time? What actually deserves your attention? What actually deserves your presence? And maybe the most important question of all, who deserves your absence? Because in the end, this was never about becoming distant. It was about becoming whole, not reacting to everything, but choosing what matters, not being available to everyone, but being present where it is real. And when that shift happens, you don't need to force anything anymore, because the moment you stop being always available, everything changes.